My name is Emily, I'm 35 years old, and I work as a systems engineer, managing satellite communications for a government contract company. My life has always been predictable, carefully put together, and everything seems to be in control, except for one area I could never manage: my family, particularly my brother Jake. Jake and I have been polar opposites since we were kids. He was always the wild child, the rule breaker who lived on the edge, while I was the quiet, studious one who rarely gave our parents cause for worry. In school, I thrived, with grades that kept my parents proud, but Jake was always in trouble, caught smoking in high school, brawling with kids after school, and always running with a crowd that gave my parents sleepless nights. And my parents? They always made excuses for him. And my mother would say, "Jake just needs time. He'll grow out of it." But that time never seemed to come. Years later, our lives had diverged even more dramatically. I went to college, worked hard, and finally found myself in a stable, well-paying job. Jake, however, drifted from one job to another, usually losing them after a few months, either from clashes with coworkers or his general refusal to follow rules. He was never arrested for anything serious, but he was always getting into petty trouble: police citations, small debts, disputes with employers. These incidents were as much a part of his life as my work was of mine. Once I finally moved out, putting some physical distance between us, I found myself relieved. Jake had always asked me for money. First $20, then $50, and soon after, much larger amounts. He'd come to me with some story or another. He needed to pay off a credit card, repair his car, or make rent. He'd say it in that urgent, almost pitiful tone, making it nearly impossible to say no. At first, I told myself it wasn't a big deal. He was my brother, after all. But over time, I started to doubt where the money was going, especially after seeing photos of him out at bars or casinos with friends I didn't recognize. It dawned on me that I was financing his lifestyle, enabling him in ways I never meant to. Then last week, he showed up at my doorstep out of nowhere. I was preparing dinner when he knocked, and he didn't even wait for an invitation to come in. He sank into my couch, looking worn and anxious, and without preamble, told me he needed $2,000. This time, there was no pleading in his tone. Instead, it sounded more like a demand. His explanation was vague and evasive, as if he were deliberately trying to hide the real reason. When I refused, his face contorted in anger. He called me heartless and selfish, accusing me of hoarding money instead of helping out my own family. I was speechless. For years, I had tried to be understanding, even when I felt he was using me. But this time it was different. This wasn't a little request for gas money or groceries. This was a huge demand, and his sense of entitlement left me feeling like a stranger in my own home. We exchanged heated words before he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Part of me expected an apology in the coming days, but instead, a few nights later, something happened that shook me to my core. 2 nights after Jake's visit, I went out to pick up a few groceries around 8:30 p.m. It was dark, and I remember double-checking that all the lights were off and doors locked before leaving. The grocery trip took no more than an hour, but as I returned and walked up my driveway, I noticed something strange. The lights in my living room were on. At first, I thought I must have made a mistake, perhaps absent-mindedly left them on. But as I stepped inside, an unsettling feeling washed over me. I looked around, and nothing appeared out of place until I walked into my bedroom. My heart sank. My desk drawers were half open, my documents were strewn about, and my jewelry box was tipped over on my dresser, completely empty. Someone had gone through my things, my private space, and had left the room in disarray. I frantically checked my belongings. My laptop was still there, but 2 of my watches were gone, and so was my prized custom-built keyboard, something I'd spent months working on and had invested a lot of money into. It wasn't just about the loss of items, it was the violation of my home, a space I had always felt safe in, now tainted by the invasion. Then it hit me: my car's security cameras. I rushed outside, pulled the footage, and checked the timestamps. There it was, plain as day: Jake, his face perfectly clear, trying my car door and then heading towards my front door. My own brother caught red-handed. I felt a mix of emotions: anger, betrayal, disappointment. But one feeling overpowered them all. This was the last straw. After years of bailing him out, of family interventions and giving him just one more chance, this was it. I tried to be patient, tried to help him get back on his feet, but he had broken into my home and stolen from me. Still, I knew that if I pressed charges, it would be explosive. Jake had a record, and another arrest could mean serious jail time. My parents, especially my mom, would never forgive me. They'd brush this off as they always did, expecting me to keep the peace. I sat there in my living room, staring at the footage, wrestling with myself over what to do. Finally, I decided to confront him directly. I called him, and after a few rings, he picked up, sounding groggy and annoyed. "What do you want, Emily?" he slurred. "Did you break into my house?" I demanded, not bothering to ease into the conversation. "PSH, what are you talking about?" He scoffed, but there was a hint of tension in his voice. "I have you on camera, Jake. You tried to open my car door, then broke into my house." I watched the footage. Silence. Then a bitter laugh. "So, what if I did?" he sneered, quickly switching to a defensive tone. "You wouldn't help me. What did you expect me to do?" I was floored. He was actually justifying it, blaming me for his actions. I held my ground, telling him he had until the next morning to return everything he'd stolen, or I'd report him to the police. He laughed. "You're not going to call the cops, Emily. You're too soft." "You've always been too soft," he said mockingly. That was it, the final confirmation I needed. I'd made my decision. The next morning, when nothing was returned, I called the police. They came, took my statement, examined the footage, and agreed it was an open and shut case. They arrested Jake later that day. I knew he'd call our parents, and I knew they'd call me furious. And, of course, they did it. My father shouted down the phone, calling me heartless, accusing me of betraying the family and ruining Jake's life. My mom was sobbing, begging me to drop this, claiming that he was just in a desperate situation and that families shouldn't turn against family. "Mom," I said, my voice steady, but filled with sadness, "he broke into my house. He stole from me. He's not just my brother. He's a criminal, and he's not going to change if everyone keeps enabling him." This was his choice. They didn't see it that way. To them, I was the villain for putting my brother in jail. I'd hoped they would finally understand, would finally see that Jake needed real help. But instead, they cut me off. They made their choice, choosing to stand by him, even as he faced charges for burglary. The court process was grueling. I had to testify, watching Jake glare at me from across the courtroom as I recounted what had happened. My parents sat behind him, refusing to even look at me. When he was sentenced to prison time, my mom cried out, "You've ruined our family." But in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. It was over. I had done what I could to help Jake, given him every chance, but this time, he'd crossed a line too far. I didn't destroy our family, he had, and they had helped him do it. It's been a few months since the trial. I haven't spoken to my parents, and I don't expect to anytime soon. I miss them, of course. Family is important to me, but so is self-respect and safety. I've started therapy to help me work through the complex feelings of loss, guilt, and anger. Slowly, I'm rebuilding, focusing on my work and the friends who have stood by me. Jake still writes to me from prison, but I haven't opened any of his letters. Maybe one day I'll feel ready to read his words, but not now. For now, I'm finally learning to put myself first, to live in a safe, peaceful home without the shadow of my brother's chaos looming over me.